Nicola Spurling here. Welcome back to my channel. Today I'm going to be talking about what it's like to grow up trans. Since around the age of 6, I have known that I'm trans. I didn't have the words to describe how that felt. I knew growing up that I felt like I was a girl, but I had never heard of anyone else feeling this way, and I didn't know how to explain it to anyone, and I didn't think that it was okay to be feeling this way. So I ended up hiding it for a long time, and because we didn't have sexual orientation and gender identity education in schools at the time, I had no one talk to me about this. I knew at some point in time what it meant to be gay, but I never knew what it meant to be trans. I actually never really understood it until I was 22 and I volunteered for Vancouver Pride. Prior to that, the only representation that I'd seen of trans people was in porn, and that's because I tried to search for how I was feeling. That's what I came across. That's not what really felt right for me. I didn't identify with these porn stars, and so I suppressed it because I thought that was the only way to be trans. When I was growing up, there were indications that how I was feeling was wrong that caused me to suppress the fact that I was trans and made me think that it wasn't okay to talk about these feelings that I was having and the feeling of being a girl, or the fact that I at the time thought that I should have been born a girl. I thought there was a mistake of some kind. I thought maybe in a past life I was a girl and that had somehow carried over into this life. And I convinced myself that maybe this is just how life is supposed to be. Maybe at some point I will be reincarnated as a woman, and that's the reason behind all of this. I then thought, well, I've seen these representations in porn of people who have undergone surgeries and who have done a medical transition of some sort, but I thought there's just no way I can get involved in that. People would judge me, people would think it was strange, and again, like I said, I didn't identify with these people that were doing porn. Not that I have anything against people who participate in porn, but it's just not who I am, and it wasn't something I could identify with. So I thought, well, maybe this is something that I would be able to do when I'm old, when my family and friends are gone. And it's a really depressing way of looking at life, but really I thought that I couldn't have anyone close to me in order for me to be able to transition. So coming to these little things that I noticed growing up, there were instances where I was told that acting a certain way was wrong. And it wasn't that I was explicitly told this, there were just instances where people made mention of things that I was doing that seemed feminine, and they said it in such a way that it felt like that was wrong and that that was something I shouldn't be doing. So for instance, I remember very vividly as a kid running into the kitchen in my pajamas, and my dad asked me, "Why are you walking like that? That's how girls walk." And he, I don't think, actually remembers that conversation, but it was something that stuck with me for a while because I didn't realize that women and men walked in a certain way. I also had an experience with my mom when we were driving around near Science World in Vancouver. There was a homeless man on the side of the road, and my mom was looking at him from behind, and based on the way that he was walking, was trying to figure out if he was a man or a woman. And she came to the conclusion that this was a woman until we drove by, looked over, and this was a person with a beard. So she said, "Oh, it was a man." And we ended up having this conversation around how men walk versus how women walk. And again, I don't think my mom remembers that conversation, but it's something that stuck with me. So I tried very hard to change the way that I was walking, and from that point on I became very sensitive to things that might be perceived as feminine, and I tried to avoid them, and I tried to act more masculine. One of the things that kids in school used to make fun of me for was the fact that I would cross my legs. Now, this is something I actually learned from my dad. He crosses his legs all the time. But in school, all of the kids told me that only girls cross their legs, and so I got it into my head that that was something I couldn't do. So all of these instances led me to believe that the way that I was acting that felt natural to me was wrong, and I suppressed them for a long time. And when I started my transition, I had to then unlearn all of that behavior, and I had to go, well, what was it that felt natural to me as a child? And it wasn't about trying to imitate a woman. I'd spent so much of my life trying to imitate what it was like to be a man. I didn't want to spend even more time trying to imitate what I thought it was like to be a woman. I just wanted to be me. I wanted to be comfortable in who I am. And I think that's sort of where I'm at today, where I don't have to fit a specific gender role. I often talk about myself as being a trans woman who is also gender non-conforming. And the reason I consider myself to be gender non-conforming is because I don't adhere to stereotypes. I am perfectly comfortable being myself in whatever that looks like, whether that is participating in stereotypically masculine activities, or whether that's walking or acting in a certain way that might be perceived as masculine, even though I identify as a woman. In high school, people used to be made fun of for not being secure about their sexuality, and it was a really difficult line to walk because on one hand, people would make fun of you for acting too feminine or acting gay, but on the other side of things, people would make fun of you for trying too hard not to look feminine or gay. So you really had to find that middle ground. And for me, that meant trying to add pieces here and there that reflected who I was without making it seem like I was feminine or gay, but making it seem like I was doing that because I was confident in my sexuality. And that's what I claimed to be at the time, even though I was really not at all secure in who I was. So one of the things that I did was I grew my hair out, and I felt really good having long hair, but there came a point where people started mistaking me for a woman, and that felt very validating on one hand, but it also really scared me, so I ended up cutting off my hair for that very reason. I also remember hanging out with people that were not necessarily unpopular, but also not part of the popular crowd. They were people that were, I think, a lot more accepting, and unfortunately, I wasn't at the point where I was able to confide in anyone about who I was and how I was feeling, but I didn't feel like these were people that judged me too much. And I ended up actually having conversations at the time around the fact that maybe I was bisexual. So I was very much able to have conversations around my sexual orientation, which is interesting because it actually took me a while past that to determine what my sexual orientation was. And I think part of that was not understanding the difference between a romantic attraction and a physical attraction, because I found that I was physically attracted to both men and women, but emotionally I was mostly just attracted to women. I think that's also part of the reason that when I came out, I was coming out as trans and I just tacked on the fact that I'm pansexual, or at the time I was labeling myself as bisexual, and it just felt like something that was really not that important. I've never really felt like it's all that big of a deal to come out as gay, and I think that's a huge privilege. I think that's because my family and my friends have always made it feel like being gay or being bi or anything to do with sexual orientation was perfectly fine. And when it came to being trans, I didn't have that feeling because I'd never really talked about it with anyone. But I'm not going to get into that too much because the topic of this video is growing up trans. So the last piece of this is really coming back to that aspect of trying to figure out how I was feeling and being scared off because what I found was porn. And it was interesting because we had a family computer at the time, so I wasn't the only one using it. And just as with a lot of adolescents, that browser history can really come back to bite you. So my parents ended up seeing a lot of my searches and had questions about them. And I came up with the usual lies that I had just been browsing the internet and suddenly pop-ups had come up with porn in them. And that just wasn't the case. I think they knew that, but I think they thought I was looking at it for reasons that I wasn't. And I don't know what they thought about that, to be quite honest. But it wasn't a conversation that we really delved into. I think they were a little bit awkward about it. I was a little bit awkward about it. And it's just something that's never really been talked about since. Now, I know I just said the last thing, but it just dawned on me that there's another piece of this as well. And that other piece is clothing. When I was growing up, I always felt like my clothing didn't fit properly. It didn't reflect who I was. Nothing felt right about the clothing that I was wearing, and I was very particular about the clothing that I was wearing. I used to go to thrift stores when I was growing up and pick up women's clothes, and I would wear them in private. I would keep them hidden in my room. It was just a way that I could experiment with that, and wearing women's clothes just seemed to feel right. I liked the way that I looked in them. But again, that shame always came back, and I was not able to reconcile that for quite a long time. And I did that. I considered myself perhaps a cross-dresser. I didn't go out in public. What I would do is maybe dress up in my room, or I would lock myself in the bathroom for ages and dress in women's clothes there. As I got older, this continued. I kept wearing women's clothes. And I say women's clothes because that's just what they were called. I understand that women's and men's clothes is sort of irrelevant. You can wear whatever you want to wear, and it doesn't affect your gender identity. But I was wearing what we perceive as women's clothes, and they were at the time very affirming. And in the lead up to my transition, I started wearing clothes out of the house when my parents would go to sleep, and I wouldn't go far. I would stand in the yard where it was dark, where no one could see me, and I would just try to imagine what it would be like to wear women's clothes on a regular basis, to go out in public wearing women's clothes, because at the time that was a big insecurity for me. And it wasn't that I wanted to be a cross-dresser. I knew that I didn't want to go in public as a man that was wearing women's clothes. I wanted to actually be a woman. And I felt like I was a woman, but I felt like I didn't have the body that represented that. I felt like I couldn't wear those clothes because I didn't feel comfortable. I felt like a man in a dress. I felt like it was shameful. I felt like it was wrong. I felt like it was just not something that I could bring myself to do. But at that point, when I got a little bit older and I realized what it was like to be trans, I saw that light at the end of the tunnel. I saw this ability for me to actually wear those clothes and be the woman that I felt that I was. And it was just all about working up the courage. So I continued to do that. I continued to go out at night and try to work up the courage to maybe go a little bit further than that and to maybe walk out to the street. Or I would go for runs along the beach late at night wearing women's clothes, which probably wasn't the safest thing to do. But no one was around. It would be 1, 2 in the morning, and I would go for a run. So now I'm at a point where I feel very comfortable in who I am. I can now go in public and I don't have a lot of fears, and I feel very comfortable in who I am now, and I can go out into the world just being me. I don't have to put on a show. I don't have to pretend to be someone else. I don't have to look a certain way in order to pass, because I don't place a lot of importance on passing anymore. So I've come a long way, and I'm still growing as a person, but as far as growing up as a child, as a trans person that didn't realize it at the time, that was my experience. I'm sure there were other things that kept me from coming out when I was younger. I'm sure that there are a lot of memories that I've suppressed, or events that are a little less memorable, but hopefully my story explains a little bit of what it's like to be trans growing up, and explains maybe why some people wait longer to transition and don't transition as children, and also explains the importance of SOGI education, which is sexual orientation and gender identity education. And that's something I'm a huge advocate for, because had I had that education as a kid, I could have talked to someone back then. I could have avoided going through those many years of turmoil, and potentially I could have transitioned before I hit puberty, which would have made my life a whole lot easier. As always, if you enjoyed this kind of content, please hit the like button. If you want to see more content like this, please hit the subscribe button and hit the bell icon so you get notified every time I post a new video. And until next time, have a great day.